I'm co-maintainer for the Drupal 8, 9, 10 Core Entity API, even though I haven't been so active lately. I'm also author and maintainer of several contributed modules. Some of them you might know, like autosave and conflict. Further, I'm also a lead software engineer at 1x Internet. Okay, first of all, I want to give credits for that presentation to Tobias Zimmerman for his entity type walkthrough that I'm heavily using for the slides here. Okay, what is an ORM? An ORM is a technique to map objects with data in relational databases. It's as simple as that. So the Drupal Entity API implements ORM, and it supports different variants of entity types. It can have fields, properties that are defined through code, and such that are defined through configuration. Further, we can have support tracking of these changes in these fields, like through revisions, and we can have translatability. A simple entity type is defined just like this. We have the annotation, we define the ID, the base table, and then we start with some entity keys that Drupal is managing automatically to create the fields. In that case, ID and UID, and the table as a starter contains only these two fields. With the entity keys, we can continue further leveraging the Drupal fields that are, for example, in this case, we add an owner field and a published field, and we add them we implement some interfaces, the entity owner interface and the entity publisher interface, and then through the method-based field definitions, we use the traits, entity owner trait and published trait, to add these fields to our base fields. And then Drupal is creating them automatically for us. And the idea of having the base fields is that we can, the base fields defined in the annotation as entity keys is that Drupal can leverage them later, when Drupal knows that these fields exist and special things can happen. Later, we are going to see that. So we continue further, we can define our own base fields. The label one, which is title in this case, it's more special because we define it ourselves, but we define it also in the annotation so that later when the label method is used, Drupal automatically is going to retrieve the data from the title field. Then because we are building an event entity type now, we are going to add a date and a description. What we see in the database is that we have now the title and the date field, and the description looks a little bit more complicated. The reason for that is because we can have fields that have multiple properties in Drupal. In that case, the description has a value and a format field. We are not going into details what they're for. Just as an example, we can have a shape item. It can have like the shape and the color, and you can save both together, like a red triangle. Imagine it like this. We create an event entity just by passing all the properties in an array to the create method of the entity. The description is nested because it has two properties, like we can see here. So we can define our getters and setters for the base fields. It's not necessary, though, because we have the get and the set methods that always retrieve us the fields, but we can have like the getters and setters for more convenience. And like we see, we get the field, and then we access the properties. In that case, value. With the case of description, it would have been value and format as well, because it's a different property on the field. So we continue with showing that entity now that we have some fields. And in order to do that, we are going to be extending the entity annotation, and we are going to be using contributed modules for the entity API entity that is adding some handlers for us that we can leverage in order to save us a lot of time and unify the way we define entities. So we define first a permission handler and then an access handler that work together. So the permission handler is going to generate permissions for us automatically, and then the access handler is going to be checking against those permissions for the currently logged in users. Then we want to define a route as well. For that, we have a link template that says like how our route is going to be looking like, where we access the entity. And then we have the route provider that's going to generate the routes for us, starting from the link template. So it's going to be checking the link templates, and it's looking for some of them, and in that case, the canonical one, and it's automatically creating it. And that's how an entity looks like as a starter. It has only the title, even though we have the description, just because we only just started. We haven't configured the other fields to be displayed. For that, we have to enable on the base fields. We have to set the display options, the view, and we can define even, for example, that we want the date, the label of the field to be displayed in one. And then, tada, we have the entity with the fields displayed. So in order to edit the entity, we do a similar thing. We continue with the handlers. We add our form handlers for editing the entity, for deleting it, or for adding a new entity. Then we continue with the link templates as well, and we add link templates for accessing the form of the entity or the edit form of it. And then we want to enable these fields, like we enable them on the view display, we want to enable them on the form display. We do that in a similar fashion by using the set display options, but this time with the form. And we can control where they're shown by the weight setting. And that's how, out of the box, an entity form would look like. In order to list the entities in the system, after we have created them, we need an overview of them. We have to define our list builder. Drupal core comes with one default list builder that supports only the operations of the entity for editing, for example. And we need to extend it and add, for example, in that case, the title, the date, and whether it's published. Then we extend the annotation a little bit, but most importantly, we add another link that is going to point to our overview. It's the collection link template. And then we also define where our list builder, and we define the path to it. And then that's how the overview would look like. And as a beginning, as a starter, we have the edit and the delete operations here. The entity is listed with the date and the published state. So we can control how data is validated when it's saved as part of the entity. For that, as an example, we are going to extend the entity with two more fields, an attendees field and a maximum number of attendees. And we see how Drupal now generates these fields also in the tables. And for the attendees, it adds one more table, the reason for which is because the attendees has a cardinality of unlimited, meaning we can have as many attendees as we want to have. And that's why it needs to be in a dedicated table. And it's, we can see it has like the field delta by which like the attendees will be sorted. Then we create a constraint, attendee count. We have a constraint class and we have a constraint validator class. The constraint class has only the validation error message. And then the validator class, it's validating, it gets as a value input, it gets the field attendees, and then it checks the count of the attendees and compares it to the maximum value that is saved on the entity in the maximum field. And if the count is bigger, then a violation will be added to the context and will be printed to the user. Here, we've disabled the possibility for other users to alter the maximum field so that only the owner can change it. And that's how it looks like when we break the validation. An error is shown when the entity is saved, and then also the field is highlighted in red. In order to track changes to entities, we have to add also our revision metadata fields. For that, we implement additionally the revision walk interface and then add the revision walk entity trait, or we simply exchange from extending from content entity base to revisionable content entity base that is doing that also already automatically for us. Then we continue with adding the revision key to the entity keys so that Drupal adds the version ID to the tables. Then we specify what's the name of the revision table and the revision metadata keys that we want to have. They're not necessary. You can define only one or the three of them. It's up to you, and you can decide how they're going to be named. And then further, we can decide whether we want to show the revision UI through the annotation from here, so that when the users are going to save the entity, they can define a revision walk message. In this case, we want to have that. Then we add further handlers for the routes, and a revision provider, a revision route provider, and then we define the link templates for accessing the revisions and the history. And then we see that we have two more tables now. We have for the basic data, and then for the attendees, we have revision table. And an UI looks like this. Automatically, when we edit the entity, we have the possibility now to define whether we want to create a new revision and then provide some text for the revision log message. And on the right, we have how the revision UI looks like. So Drupal, that was a content entity up till now, the event. So in order to extend that content entity and make it variable, we are going to create an event type. That's a config entity. It's a little bit different. It's not saved into multiple tables. It's saved. It lives just like a configuration object that can be exported and deployed through different environments. It has an annotation absolutely similar to the other one. So there is no much information here. It can have schema that defines the types of the properties that it has, and on saving it, that data will be validated against the schema. We continue with the same way. We have defined the same handlers, access handlers, the route providers, and just absolutely everything is similar to the content entity. We define our list builder as well here, and then the form handlers, absolutely the same, no difference to the content entity. In this case, we have to also define our own form in order to show, to define how the fields will be populated by the user. Okay, so, and here we are going to create two event types, webinar and an on-site event type, and then we are going to configure them differently. For that, we have to define that the event type is a bundle of the event. We do that like this, that on the event entity type, we define its bundle entity type as event type, and on the event type, we specify that it's a bundle of the event. And then the idea is that both can know what they're meant for. And then we define also the field UI-based route, where we are going to be, that's the route where we are going to be able to manage the form displays, the fields, and so on of the entity. And like we see it now, on the event types, we have some more operations for accessing that specialized customization of the entity settings. Here, we are going to create a new field from the managed fields. We are going to create a link field for the webinar because the webinars are online. And then that we can do through configuration simply. We create the field. There's some stuff that we can configure, like making the field configurable, defining whether it's an external link or not. Every field has different settings. So in order to be able to configure the form display and the view display for the base fields, we need some more things. We need to make it possible that these fields are configurable in the view and in the form displays. For that, we just call the dedicated methods, and suddenly we can see that we can manage these fields through configuration. And from now on, we don't have to set the weight through code, where the field will be displayed. We can use drag and drop and define how and where the fields will be positioned and what kind of widgets or renderers will be used to render these fields in the edit or in the view form. We can translate the entities. For that, we add one more entity key for the language code, and then we flag the entities being translatable with the corresponding annotation. We define the table that's going to be containing the translatable data, and then we define the revision data table that's going to be containing the data that's both translatable and revisionable. And that are the new, that's how the tables look like now. We have the field data and then the revision field data. And we see that as a starter, it doesn't have first much information. It contains mostly the published field and then the language code. So in order to make the fields translatable and revisionable, we have the base fields. We have to call the method set translatable and revisionable then, and then we see that the title now, it wasn't in the revision field table, and now it is in the revision field table. We can configure translations per bundle as well. For that, we visit the content language and translation route, and there we enable translation for our entity type, and further down, we can configure it also whether we want the bundle on-site or webinar to be translatable. We can then enable translation only for some of the fields. In this case, you might decide we don't want the URL to be translatable because like the German webinar and the Spanish webinar will be leading to the same page. But you might decide that they're leading to different webinars. It's just at the same time, and the one is translated, like with audio translation, the other is without. And you can then make it translatable and provide you different links. In order to translate the entities, now we have another operation that is appearing on the overview of the events, and from here we can translate as well. Then, in order to translate the entity, we can go to the Translate tab. We can add a translation from here, and we are on the overview of the Spanish page, where we now can enter the translatable metadata. The translatable content, I'm sorry. So, in order to, before that, we talked about that we were adding access handlers and permission providers. That results into the following, that now here we have, on that route of the permissions, we see currently that we have permissions only for events. We see only event. We don't see on-site or webinar. And we can define that the different user groups can have different permissions. Usually you would like to have like that the anonymous user group is able to view event types. And you would like that only editors are able to create event types. But you might decide at some point that you want actually to have different groups. One group to be able to create event types of the type events of the type webinar, and another group of the event type on-site. For that, we are changing the permission granularity in the entity annotation from entity type to bundle. And now what we see is we are getting much more permissions. Here on that screenshot, we have only the on-site one. If we scroll down, we are going to be having the permissions also for the webinar one. And we have also permissions for the event types, who is able to create different event types, not the event entities, but the event types, like webinar and on-site. Then we can have also entity queries in Drupal in order to query data. For that, we get initialize the storage. Then from the storage, we get the query object. Then in Drupal, we have to define the access check. The idea of that is that when you're doing some cron jobs, you would like to turn the access check off so that you're able to find all the entities in the system and do some altering of them or do some data, do some processing with them. You always want to have them. But if the query that we are doing will be intended for the users to go through the page and to find some information, then we would like to have the access check turned on so that the users don't get access to data they shouldn't be getting access to. Then we can define conditions. For us, the first is the field that we are querying, and then it's the value against we are querying. In that case, we want to have all the webinars, and that's why we say we add a condition, type, and webinar. And then if we want to search for a specific date, in that case, we are not saving a timestamp, we are saving a date time, so it's the date. What we do is we add a condition on the date, and then the value, and here we write SQL, basically. So we are starting with the date, and then we don't care about the time. That's why we just want to filter only about the date, and then we use a wildcard to match everything behind. Then we can define the operator to use. In that case, we want to use the like operator. And further, we want to be able to, we have the ability to define whether that query is only against, like it's searching across all translations of the entity or just a specific translation. In that case, it's going to be searching only for webinars that have a Spanish translation and are on the 21st of July. Then we execute the query, which returns an array where we have like as a key the revisions and as a value the ID of the entity. In that case, it's the entity ID 2, and we can assign that to a variable, entity IDs, for example, and then we can use the storage in order to load the entities. And that's how the entity type annotation looks like at a glance. We see that we started with just basic 2-3 lines, and now we came up to 2 pages of entity annotation that contains all the different stuff for our entity. And yeah, that's basically I try to be really quick so that I can answer your questions if you have some. And the presentation, it's also, you can see at the beginning of the slides, there is a link for the presentation that you can use to download the slides. The idea of the presentation is to be used also by you and your teams for making a short introduction. And of course, you should be spending a little bit more time with your students when you're explaining them all of that. It's just a really brief overview of everything. Any questions?
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. Very useful. If we want to add a layout builder display option in these custom entities, how we can do?
Sorry,
is it possible to add the layout builder option in these entities, or?
Yeah, of course. You can extend and add the annotation, and you can use it as well. Yes.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. I've got a question about updating entities. Let's say you have an entity which is not revisionable or has no revisions, and you want to add translations or revisionable. How do you go about it? Do you use the entity update module, or do you use the hook updates to update these custom entities?
There are some pretty good examples about that actually in Drupal Core, and that's what I can always suggest whenever you have like these kind of questions. I would always suggest to always go and check in the Drupal Core, because Drupal Core has gone through many alterations. In that case, for example, the taxonomies, they have been made revisionable. And there is like perfect examples, like all the methods that have to be called in order to make an entity from being non-revisionable to revisionable. It's just the examples in Core. If you want to, we can check later together. I just don't want to search in code now during the presentation, but like there, like in the entity storage and definition update manager, like there are examples how we can convert an entity from being non-revisionable to revisionable. It's not really complicated. It works. Any more questions? That's good. Or not? Okay then, I think we are ready here. Thank you for being here. And enjoy the rest of the Drupal Dev Days, and see you tonight. I've done it a little bit quicker than I expected.
Yeah, wow.
I tried to be really, really quick, but oh. Оп. Благодаря. Малко по-бързо. Аз си мисля, че малко отнеме, но... Аз в началото бързах супер много, защото аз имам 50 слайда, нали? И някой тръгна да ги пропускам. И си викам,